This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Holly,
Yeah.
you like to hear about the history of the Federation?
I very much do.
What about, history that maybe didn't go our way so well?
I'm comfortable with that. I'd like to think we learned from our mistakes.
Well, speaking of mistakes, we're going to talk about the Battle of Wolf 359 today. How do you feel about that?
I think that's a super fantastic idea.
For those of you who don't know, the Battle of Wolf 359 was an engagement between the Borg Collective and the United Federation of Planets that took place in 2367, and it was a crippling blow to the Federation and one of the most devastating conflicts in the history of that organization, and it took more than a year to rebuild the fleet after that.
And so in this episode, we're going to talk about the events that led up to what turned out to be such a disastrous battle, about the Borg generally, and also about the aftermath of that battle. And we're also going to talk about some of the Federation ships that were unfortunately lost in that conflict. But to start, we really need to lay the groundwork by explaining the Borg and what their designs on humanity and the Federation were.
So, hailing from the Delta Quadrant, the Borg were a pseudo-species of cybernetic beings, and as a hive sentience, there was little to no individuality inside its collective, and their goal was to perfect all living beings by assimilating them into this collective. And once assimilated, a being would lose its individuality and be enhanced cybernetically to perform at optimum efficiency for the goals of the collective.
I have to have a quick aside, Brian, and say, does that horrify you as much as it does me?
Yeah, it does.
Like, the idea of losing individuality is so terrifying to me.
Yeah, that's all I have.
Right. And their origins are actually pretty unclear, although the existence of the Borg in the Delta Quadrant dates back to at least 1484 that we have on record. But by the time of Wolf 359, they had assimilated thousands of worlds.
Once assimilated, drones in the collective ceased to grow body hair and their skin grew pale. Cybernetic implants would be surgically grafted onto the being, or in some cases created out of nanoprobes, and varied. These cybernetic implants varied in what they did based on the intended function of the drone. And they slept minimally in a regeneration cycle aboard their Borg cube.
So if a drone were damaged in the course of its duties, it would return to its post if possible, and it would be repaired if the damage was minimal, or it would be used for spare parts for new drones if that damage was not something that could be repaired and they needed parts. Children that were assimilated into the collective had modest implants, but they weren't inducted into the collective until they were older. So in that childhood state, they were placed in maturation chambers where their growth was accelerated until they could become functioning drones.
Although the implants in drones varied by duty, there were some commonalities. Naturally, they all had communications transceivers implanted so they could send and receive messages to the collective. And they were all equipped with force fields to prevent attacks from energy weapons, and they were also equipped with injectors to inject new beings to the collectives with nanoprobes for assimilation on the go.
And the Borg traveled in a cube-like spaceship. I think that's probably what most people think of first when they think of the Borg. And this measured more than 3 kilometers to an edge, and it had an internal volume of about 28 cubic meters. Its systems were decentralized and redundant, so as much as 78% of the cube could be destroyed, and the whole thing could still operate capably. And these were crewed by as few as 5,000 drones, or as many as 129,000.
These cubes could speed through the galaxy at sublight, warp, and transwarp speeds. To outside observers scanning the ship, it would appear as though it was armed with no weapons, and it didn't really need them. It would hold enemy ships in its tractor beam, drain their shields, and then beam drones aboard the ship to assimilate everyone they found. They did have a cutting beam, though, that could be used as a weapon, and that kind of plays significantly into some of its tactics during Wolf 359.
And these also had a number of missile-like projectiles that they could launch into space if need be. Their electromagnetic shields were also unique in that they could assimilate to the weapons of those firing upon them, making it difficult for conventional energy weapons to do any real damage.
The ship could also repair very easily, so if an enemy didn't destroy it in 1 or 2 shots, the likelihood of the cube being destroyed was very, very small.
And the Federation really didn't know much about the Borg at all until rumors began circulating of them in the 2350s. They definitely did not have firsthand knowledge until 2365, just 2 years prior to the Battle of Wolf 359. And it was at that point that the entity known as Q transported the USS Enterprise to the J-25 system to meet a Borg cube there. It was more than 7,000 light years from Starbase 185, which was the closest Federation starbase to the Borg at that time.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Q was actually being very helpful there in that situation. Like, I'm going to take you so far out of your galaxy you can't even comprehend and introduce a threat to you that's probably going to catch your scent and come after you.
I'm not sure why you would presume that helpfulness would be his first, priority.
Yeah. So, because of Q's helpfulness, the Borg were able to learn significant details about the Federation and the Enterprise by boarding the Federation vessel and downloading all the information they wanted directly. The crew of the ship found that they could do very little to stop the Borg, and when they fired on them, they found that their weapons were ineffective. They tried escaping in the Enterprise, but found that it was impossible to lose the Borg.
The only way that they were able to escape was through the intervention of the entity Q.
See, he could be helpful.
He could, but that wasn't always his motivation. Who transported the Enterprise and its crew back to Federation space. Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise, knew that now that the Borg were aware of the existence of the Federation and all of the lives they could potentially assimilate there, that they were going to come for them.
So, eventually, of course, they did come. Preparation for this invasion began in earnest in 2366 after the Federation colony of New Providence on planet Joure 4 had been found to be gone, literally scooped from the planet's surface. During the investigation of what had happened, the Enterprise determined that the devastation was identical to what they'd encountered in the J-25 system when they first encountered the Borg.
Starfleet Tactical sent Vice Admiral J.P. Hansen and Lieutenant Commander Shelby to investigate. Hansen was a friend of Picard's and a hard-driving admiral. And for her part, Shelby was an ambitious officer and was put in charge of handling Starfleet's defensive planning for the Borg invasion under Hansen's direct supervision.
With the knowledge that this was indeed a Borg attack at New Providence, Starfleet issued a general yellow alert to all ships in its fleet, and Hansen returned to Starbase 324 to begin preparations for the defense of the Federation in earnest. That same day, at 1900 hours, the USS Lalo, a Federation freighter, set out from Zeta Alpha 2 on a supply run to Sentinel Minor 4. At 2212 hours, Starbase 157 received a transmission from the Lalo, which had reported contact with an object in space, a cubical object.
That signal was actually cut off mid-transmission, and the Lalo was unable to respond to further hails. At this point, Admiral Hansen dispatched the Enterprise to the Lalo's last known coordinates to investigate further, as the Enterprise was the only ship in the area, and Federation reinforcements were no closer than 6 full days away.
As the Enterprise raced to the given coordinates, they indeed encountered a Borg cube. Their single demand was that Captain Picard beam aboard the cube for reasons that didn't seem apparent. Naturally, Picard didn't like this idea and exchanged fire with the Borg vessel, but that wasn't going to work out in the favor of the Enterprise for long. Picard ordered a retreat to the nearby Paulson Nebula, where it could remain hidden for a time.
The Borg launched electromagnetic charges into the nebula, and it caused enough damage to the Enterprise that Picard ordered them out of hiding. But he ended up being captured in the ensuing conflict. Picard's first officer, Commander William Riker, assumed command of the Enterprise and watched as the Borg left quickly, but the Enterprise remained in hot pursuit.
Riker, with the help of Commander Shelby, developed a plan to pull the Borg cube out of warp by sending an away team to board the vessel. This team, led by Shelby, was successful in pulling the cube out of warp, but they also discovered that the Borg had assimilated Captain Picard into a being that was now referred to as Locutus of Borg. This caused a problem for Starfleet and specifically the crew of the Enterprise because in assimilating Picard, they took all of his knowledge into their collective as well.
Picard was privy to Starfleet's defensive plans against the Borg, and he was intimately familiar with the mind of his own first officer and how Riker might respond to such threats. This was not good news for the Federation in any way, because thanks to Picard's knowledge, all of Riker's plans to disable the Borg cube were foiled, and the Borg lit off toward Earth, leaving the Enterprise disabled in space.
At this point, Admiral Hansen had hastily assembled a flotilla of almost 40 Federation vessels at Wolf 359. The Klingon Empire was in the process of assembling a fleet to support the stand at Wolf 359, and there were even discussions of asking the Romulan Empire to aid as well. So great was the threat that the Federation assumed the Borg to be.
At stardate 44002.3, in the year 2367, the Borg cube arrived at Wolf 359 and ordered the assembled fleet of Admiral Hansen to peacefully accompany it to the Sol system or face destruction.
Naturally, Admiral Hansen would not accept such terms, and the conflict began, and the fleet engaged the Borg. The USS Melbourne, an Excelsior-class ship, was one of the first to be destroyed in the battle. It approached side by side with the USS Saratoga, a Miranda-class starship, and the Melbourne had its shields drained by the Borg cube. The collective then used that cutting torch we talked to previously to partially vaporize its entire saucer section.
What was left of the Melbourne rammed the cube, but it was ineffective, and the cube then attacked the Saratoga. The Saratoga, which was under the command of Captain Martin Jedlicka and First Officer Benjamin Sisko, were trapped in the Borg tractor beam. The Borg engaged their shield, draining the beams, and then used their cutting torch to breach decks 1 through 4 of the Saratoga, killing many, including the captain.
Many of the crew made it to escape pods, including Sisko and his son Jake, though his wife was lost in the attack. And eventually the cutting torch, in tandem with a warp core breach, vaporized what was left of the Saratoga.
The Ambassador-class USS Yamaguchi and Nebula-class USS Bellerophon raced in to help these disabled ships, but they too were destroyed by the Borg. Under the command of Picard, now operating as Locutus, the Borg mopped up the 39-ship fleet in just a matter of minutes. In a last-ditch effort to rally the remaining ships, Admiral Hansen ordered a withdrawal, but his ship was destroyed.
His last words to Commander Riker on the Enterprise, who'd fixed that ship enough to race to Wolf 359 hoping to do some good by joining the fight, were, quote, "The fight does not go well, Enterprise. We're attempting to withdraw and regroup. Rendezvous with the fleet." And then the transmission died.
In the final accounting, all 39 Federation starships of Hansen's flotilla were lost, and nearly 11,000 people perished. Though there's no solid number, we do know that many of the survivors were assimilated. The Borg cube left quickly, pressing on toward Earth, where a state of emergency was declared in anticipation of Borg invasion. And then the Enterprise arrived at Wolf 359 in the aftermath to survey the wreckage. There were no life signs, and no power signals from the remaining debris.
The Borg swept through the last defense of Earth, which was the Martian asteroid Sentry Belt, leaving the Enterprise as the only thing that could possibly save the citizens of Earth from the Borg. Leaving the wreckage at Wolf 359 behind, the Enterprise raced back toward Earth to make their last stand against the Borg.
Riker knew that desperate measures would be called for, and he'd need to do something completely unexpected because Locutus, with Picard's knowledge, would be able to read all of his moves. So he came up with an incredibly unorthodox plan in order to confound the Borg and win the day.
To that end, he and Commander Shelby developed a plan where they would separate the saucer section of the Enterprise from the nacelles in a feint. Locutus would assume that since the more powerful weapons would be in the lower section of the ship, he would ignore the saucer as an obvious feint, but that's where the plan was being hatched. The saucer section, ignored by the Borg, fired a spread of antimatter as a distraction.
The antimatter spread was harmless. It was kind of akin to lighting off fireworks, really, but in the confusion that ensued, it masked the approach of a shuttlecraft, where the Enterprise's lieutenant commanders Data and Worf were aboard, and they used that distraction to board the Borg cube.
After that bit of razzle-dazzle, Worf and Data managed to find their way on board and located Locutus aboard the ship. Using phasers they'd modified to modulate frequencies in order to be effective against the Borg, they fought their way to Locutus, were able to steal him away aboard the shuttlecraft, and once the shuttlecraft was out of the magnetic field of the cube, they were able to beam directly to sickbay on the Enterprise, which was very fortunate and timely because just as they transported, the shuttlecraft was destroyed by Borg weapons.
I just want to point out that while this is a very serious matter, I have to laugh a little because I don't think Worf would enjoy you calling his work razzle-dazzle. That's all I'm saying.
Well, that was Riker's work. Worf was a beneficiary of the razzle-dazzle.
There you go. This whole series of moves gave the Enterprise the opportunity to try to study the assimilation process, while the Borg cube ignored the Enterprise and their hostage and continued its march toward planet Earth. Locutus was revived in sickbay against the protests of Dr. Beverly Crusher, but Locutus explained twice that he meant no harm and would serve as the voice of the Borg as they went about their business, working to force the unconditional surrender of Earth.
That's a very interesting cognitive dissonance. Like, no, seriously, I mean no harm. I'll act as the voice as we completely harm everyone.
You know, there's harm and there's harm. I don't know, is harm in the eye of the beholder? It's a little nebulous at that point.
I suppose so. So during this parley, Lieutenant Commander Data realized that there was a subspace signal being transferred between Locutus and the Borg collective. Now, Data was an android, and he used his positronic brain to actually interface with Locutus in an attempt to read the signals and try to better understand what they could about the Borg, because that information could be key to them finally destroying the collective.
Although Locutus tried to resist Data's intrusion, Data was able to determine how the Borg functioned and how their commands worked. Because they were a collective, a command sent to one could conceivably be obeyed by all of them. And so Riker ordered Data to place an order for the Borg to deactivate all of its weapons. And that didn't quite work out, as Data couldn't quite seem to access the vital functions that would convey that information.
And by this point, the Borg had arrived in Earth's orbit, and the Enterprise had caught up to the ship. And because they were unable to sever the link between Data and the collective any other way, the Borg opened fire on the Enterprise, and Riker commanded the ship to ram the Borg ship in a suicide run if nothing else would work.
And again, I think it's important to note, like, that sounds like an insane move, but really the future of all mankind was at stake at that point. But as the Borg cutting beam started to cut into the Enterprise, Data stayed Riker's hand. Some part of Picard's consciousness had broken through and actually said the word sleep to Data. And using this as a clue, Data discovered the subroutine for the Borg regeneration cycle hidden in the code of Locutus. Since sleep and regeneration were lower class functions, he found that those weren't protected the same way a weapons system would be.
So Data was able to issue a command for the entire Borg collective to enter their regeneration cycle. Under orders from Riker, Commander Shelby led an away team to find out exactly what was going on the Borg cube, as their weapons ceased functioning and was no longer protected by its electromagnetic field. Shelby discovered that they were indeed in a regeneration cycle, but the way Data sent the commands created a feedback loop that issued a self-destruct command for the Borg cube.
And with the destruction of the Borg cube imminent, Riker ordered the away team back to the Enterprise, and then ordered the Enterprise away from that Borg cube, which only makes sense. The cube itself exploded, forcing Locutus to convulse violently as his connection to that collective was disrupted. And the doctors were able to stabilize him and remove the Borg implants, and soon enough, Captain Picard was back to his normal self.
And that was the end of the Borg threat for the time being. But that didn't mean that Wolf 359 and this entire episode was not a disaster for Starfleet. Losing so many ships set back their exploration and defense efforts significantly. Commander Shelby was put in command of efforts to rebuild the fleet to get it back up to previous levels, and at the time it was expected that would take at least a year.
To me, a year doesn't sound like that much considering how much they had lost and had to fix, but
yeah,
it's all different. Picard and the crew of the Enterprise repaired the ship. They carried on along their mission. Another notable survivor of Wolf 359, Benjamin Sisko, would eventually get command of the former Cardassian space station, Deep Space Nine. And in his work there to prevent the Dominion War, he was given use of the USS Defiant, which was a warship that was a result of the efforts of Commander Shelby to keep Starfleet ready in case of another Borg-like invasion or war.
And that's what we have about humanity's first encounter with the Borg Collective and the Battle of Wolf 359 and its immediate aftermath. That could have gone very poorly for the entire Federation of Planets. Not just Earth, because where would they go next with, billions of new drones?
Well, and it's one of those things that, not to put too fine a point on it, but when I review these types of moments in human history, I just count myself lucky to be alive.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I don't have any mail this week.
Alrighty, Rue.
But we would like to hear from you if you want to use the contact form on the Authentic History website. To do that, we'd love to hear from you. Holly, where can people find you?
I'm at Surliest Girl on Twitter. I'm at SurlyGirly5 on Instagram. You can find my podcast, Stuff You Missed in History Class, at missedinhistory.com. And then you and I do some Star Wars fun together.
Yeah, we do. You can find that show at fullofsith.com. And it's Full of Sith, and we talk about Star Wars and pretty much just Star Wars. You can find me on Twitter at Swankmatron. And, you can find everything else I do from there. As far as Authentic History goes, you can find us on Twitter at Authentics. You can look up Authentic History on Facebook and find us there, or you can go to authentichistory.com, check out our backlog of check out our backlog of episodes, and just send us a message. We'd really love to hear from you. If you want to give our show a review or a rating wherever you listen to it, we'd love that too. Holly, is there anything I missed?
Nope.
So, and you don't have anything else?
I do not.
Well, until next time, then.